Hey guys, Johnny B here, new published author of the book titled God's Gift to You, Book One, where I share my story about what it was like for me when I was born into this world and the things that I had experienced in my adolescent years that led me to having a mental health disease. I am talking about the physical aspect of it, as well as childhood trauma, as well as environmental factors. There are many things that can lead to a person having a mental health illness. According to researchers and scientists, the physical aspect, meaning if you encountered an injury or sustained a blunt force impact to your head, that can lead to having a mental health illness. That's the physical aspect of it. Also, according to researchers and scientists, mental health illnesses can also be passed down, meaning if you have a parent or a sibling who has a mental health illness, it can make your risk factor greater than others of developing a mental health disease. My mother told me in my mid to late 20s that her mother went crazy and died in a mental health institution. Because my mother is very uneducated, meaning that she did not finish high school, nor did she further her education beyond the grade level that she dropped out at. There's a lot of things that my mom doesn't know about. So when she said to me when I was in my mid 20s to my late 20s that her mother went crazy and died in a mental institution, I had to say to my mother like, "Mom, first of all, people don't die just from going crazy. There had to have been some other factors involved, which I know nothing about because I've never met my mother's mother." So my mother was taken from her mother when she was like 7 years old, never to see her mother again or hear from her mother again. So when my mother told me that, some red flags went up because in my book, God's Gift to You, Book One, where I share my experiences that I had in my adolescent years, talking about child abuse. My mother was very abusive to her 4 children. She had 2 girls and 2 boys. And there were some other factors involved as far as my mother being abusive to her children, but the bottom line is that, like I said, there were other factors involved, so it's very difficult to explain. So, mom was battling the disease of addiction, during the time she was raising her 4 children, and a lot of her signs and symptoms, most people tied to the fact that she was battling the disease of addiction. However, later on in years, when mom got of age and was no longer battling the disease of addiction, there was still signs and symptoms. Like there was a lot going on with my mom. So besides the fact that she was undereducated, and she battled the disease of addiction. I truly feel like there was some underlying mental health issues going on that went undetected because of the obvious, which was her using and abusing drugs. But again, as I stated, later on in the years, as mom got older and the disease of addiction was no longer um, a factor, she was still displaying some signs and symptoms of something else going on. So, on top of mom telling me that her mom went crazy and died in a mental health institution, and the fact that obviously my mother had some mental health or has some mental health issues that went undetected. And to this day, mom has not talked to her providers about her signs and symptoms. So she, to this day, doesn't have a diagnosis. But I know that there's some stuff going on. And how I know that is because my sister also struggled with a mental health illness. In my book, God's Gift to You, book one, I talk about how as a young girl, my sister was 1 year older than me, and she and I were very close because mom had two girls, two boys. And she was my only sister. We were a age one year apart in age. She was older than me and then my two brothers. But even as a little girl, I would see my sister go through some things and not understand what was happening with my sister. And throughout the years, this behavior continued, it progressed. Um, so as she became an adult, she was first diagnosed with depression, which then got upgraded to manic depression, which then became just manic, and then her final diagnosis was bipolar. According to researchers, scientists, textbook, bipolar is one of the top main mental health illnesses that can be inherited, passed down from family member to family member. I myself started experiencing some signs and symptoms of a mental health illness in my mid 20s. And from my mid 20s to probably my mid 30s, I began my journey of discovering that I had a mental health disease. So, by going to my providers and talking about, the signs and the symptoms that appeared in my life in my mid 20s, and talking to them about what I was experiencing, what I was going through. Um, from there, they recommended that I start counseling, which I did that for some time. From there, they wanted me to see a psychiatrist. Now, back then, counselors were simply people who you would go and have a hour counseling session where for an hour you sit with someone and you talk about the things that have been going on in your life, the things that you're struggling with, therapy. But back then, counselors could not prescribe medication. So after some time of going to counseling and therapy, they then recommended that I see a psychiatrist because they wanted to introduce medication. And like I said, back then counselors could not prescribe meds. So I then had to start seeing a psychiatrist and meds were prescribed. Anyway, while on my journey of discovering that I had a mental health disease and through the years of me continuing my education because once I started realizing that I had a mental health illness, I now had to learn about my mental health illness, the diagnosis, which I was diagnosed with depression. I have panic attacks and I have anxiety attacks. So I started to learn about mental health illnesses and signs and symptoms, causes and effects, different diagnoses, um, all the textbook information. And that is when I started to realize that when mom told me that her mother went crazy and died in a mental health institution, that obviously my mother might have had some mental health illness that again went undetected, but it did not stop her from being abusive to her four children. Um, my sister, I watched my sister through her whole life, even as a little girl, go through things that I could not understand, but soon would later come to realize that these same things were happening to me. Um, and I needed to get help, and I did. Now, depending on your diagnosis, because there are different diagnoses when it comes to a mental health illness. You have depression, you have bipolar, you have one that is most common, social anxiety. There are a lot of people walking around with social anxiety, very common one. Um, I gotta slow my brain down and I'm gonna tell you why I gotta pause sometimes. So, depression, manic, bipolar, social anxiety, researchers and scientists list autism under mental health illness, um, ADHD, um, the list goes on. Now, again, depending on what your diagnosis is, your signs and symptoms may vary. Um, for me, with my depression, so as a young girl, I talk about how I had physical fistfights with men twice my age, twice my size, twice my stamina and strength. And during these fistfights, I had taken some blows to my head. It did not really seem to affect me right away. Like I said, these things happen in my adolescent years before my body and my mind fully matured. It was still growing. It was still um, processing things. And, when we're young, we tend to be able to bounce back from things quicker. Um, but as we age over the years, sometimes those things can catch up to us. So, besides the fact that mental health diseases could possibly run in my family, besides the fact that I had taken um, blunt impacts to my head in my adolescent years, besides the fact that I am a survivor of childhood abuse, childhood trauma. So these are all the things that scientists and researchers say could possibly lead to a mental health illness. Like I said, in my younger years, it didn't seem like these things had affected me. I was able to continue on in my life. There was a lot of things at stake that, as far as being able to continue to educate myself, mom never finished high school. My sister never finished high school. Um, My sister struggled with reading, writing, math. Um, I felt obligated to educate myself because I knew what a difference education could make in a person's life. Besides, I loved learning. I love learning. I love reading. I love writing. I love expanding my mind, my perspective. Um, I felt education was important because one, mom never worked. Two, my sister never worked. Um, Mom and my sister both spent their life on Social Security disability. And for me, I did not consider Social Security disability because, like I said, in my younger years, everything seemed okay with me. I was so busy trying to take care my mother and my sister. Um, for me, I felt like I had to push myself. I had to do better. Again, I had a lot of reasons that pushed me to further my education. Um, when I turned 19 years old, I got pregnant. So now I have another life that I was responsible for. And because of my childhood and the fact that mom never worked, um, and because mom never worked, we were what would be considered poor. um, we had to live in the poorer neighborhoods. And when you live in poorer neighborhoods, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in those poorer neighborhoods. Um, Growing up in Boston, you have teenage pregnancies, you have gangs, you have violence. Like, it's just so much going on in the poorer communities because, I mean, it could be a lot of reasons. We don't need to get into that right now, but just to give you guys an idea, I'm going to give you a couple of examples why so many things go on in the poorer neighborhoods. One, because people deal drugs. Some of these people may not have acquired the education that they needed to get a job, not alone a decent job paying above minimum wage. For some people, maybe they have an arrest record. And if you have what are called felonies, that can affect you with gaining employment. And for some people, maybe selling drugs was like their only option. However, when you live in a community and people are dealing drugs and there's like gangs are like fighting over territory, fighting over money, you know, people carry weapons. You know, people start opening fire in neighborhoods, and it's a lot of stuff, like I said, that goes on in those poor communities. And then you have the people that are buying the drugs and using and abusing the drugs, um because people are now addicted to the drugs being sold. These people start having behaviors that are unhealthy and can cause harm. So those are just a few examples of the kind of things that can go on in the poor neighborhoods. And I know that very well because I grew up in those poor neighborhoods. And when I had my daughter, I was so afraid for her life that it pushed me to do the things necessary to try to create a better life for her, to educate myself where I was not just able to get a job, but be able to get a good job, paying enough money that, I could move to a quote unquote better community, quote unquote better neighborhood. I did not want my daughter to have to grow up in those poorer neighborhoods and be exposed to the things that go on in those poorer neighborhoods. So I educated myself, and I also worked my most of my life. Like, even though I was diagnosed with a mental health disease, I was still able to, you know, educate myself, get jobs. However, I don't know if it is tied to my mental health disease. What I found out is that it didn't matter how much I educated myself, it didn't matter that I was able to get good jobs. I struggled with keeping a job. So I spent years of my life like getting good jobs. Like I'd get a job, it'll probably last 2 years. Something or another would happen. I would get fired. Um, I'd have to draw unemployment until I found another job. I would get another good job. That job would last for maybe a year here or 2 years there. And then for whatever reason, I'd get fired again. And this continued on for many years. And I did well in my younger years when I lived in Boston. I also lived in Springfield, Mass for some time because when I was a little girl, after so many years of being abused by my mom and getting in trouble with the law, they decided to take me from my mother's household and put me in what is called protective custody. And what that meant was that when they took me from my mother's household, I would end up being placed in a different variety of foster homes. They had to keep moving me around because sometimes they put me in a foster home, it didn't work out, and I also got labeled as a runner. And what that meant was every time they would put me in a foster home, I would run away and find my way back to Boston to go look for my mother and my family, my siblings. Like when they took me from my mother, all I could think about was where was my mom? How is she doing? Where are my siblings? Are they okay? Um, so I always felt this obligation to my family. So, like I said, after a while of them placing me in various foster homes and the foster homes not working out because I got labeled as a runner, they ended up putting me in a locked facility. So for the next few years of my life, I spent in locked facilities. Um, And that went on for some time, and, through all this insanity, right, when I talk about God's gift to you, which is the title of my book, I am not speaking about religion. What I am speaking about is there is good and bad in everything, and even though when I tell my life story, it sounds horrific, it was, but I got some gifts along the way. I learned how to survive some stuff. I learned how to, at some point in life when things are horrific around you, you tend to go into autopilot. When I would experience things like I didn't cry about it. Um, I think I was just numb to it all. I just, for whatever reason, like stuff would happen and you just get up and keep going. Like there's no time to sit there or be sad or to think about what just happened. You tend to just go into autopilot through life. And that went on for a lot of years until I got pregnant and had my daughter. Now, I think because once I turned 18, 19 years old, the state had to release me. They could no longer hold me, which mean I was free to go on with my life. And being that I got pregnant at 19 years old, it became imperative to me to find my real family because even though my daughter knew my foster family, which was the last home that I ended up in that seemed to have finally worked out after being placed in various foster homes and locked facilities and the later years of my life, they tried another foster home after they kept me in a locked facility for some time, and that foster home worked out and I stayed. So my daughter, she knew my foster family, but for me, that wasn't enough. I wanted my daughter to know my real mother and my real family. So once I was able to leave the custody of the Department of the Social Services, I left Springfield, Mass, which is where they put me, and I lived my life for like 4 or 5 years. I made my way back to Boston. And, when they took me from my mother at a young age and they put me in Springfield, Mass, and I spent years in Springfield, Mass. I don't know if I forgot about all the things that happened to me in my childhood growing up in Boston, but I think that when I went back to Boston as an adult, and by the time I was in my mid-20s and started experiencing signs and symptoms of a mental health illness, which mostly was like I out of the blue started having panic attacks, I started having anxiety attacks, I started having racing thoughts. I went through a period of time where although my life seemed like it was going well, being a new mom, going to school, working, I was in a long-term relationship with someone for 18 years. And in the beginning of that relationship, we were happy, we were in love. I was back home in Boston. I had found my family. Life seemed to be going great. So when I started having these signs and symptoms, I couldn't understand why I was having these signs and symptoms. I couldn't understand what was causing me to experience these signs and symptoms. Like I said, most of the time, I would start having panic attacks. I would start having anxiety attacks. There was a period of time where I cried all the time, like, I just felt so horrible. It was affecting my 18-year relationship with this young man. Like I said, in the beginning years, everything seemed like it was going well for me. He was not physically abusive to me. He was not abusive to me in any way that I was aware of. Um, in fact, he was only 19 when I met him, and I was 20. Um, and as the years progressed, 5 years into our relationship, like, I had my own apartment, he was living with me, we was doing the family thing, everything seemed great until it was not. 5 years into the relationship, things started happening to me that affected my relationship with this young man, affected my relationship with my now 4 or 5-year-old daughter. Like, there was just things going on, and it was scary. Um, in fact, it was the guy I was with at the time who suggested that I start seeking therapy, that I start get going to counseling. Like stuff was happening and I wasn't aware of it um until it got so bad that I started to identify like when these things would take place. I started acknowledging when these things would take place. And so my partner at the time suggested that I start going to counseling and even offered to go with me to help me to figure out what was going on with me. Like he was very concerned about me and he had every reason to be. Um so I started my journey of, getting counseling and I went on meds and like I said, I think a lot of it was because when I went back home to Boston, I think I might have forgot about those childhood experiences that I went through in Boston. And then I was out of Boston so long, maybe that's why it wasn't affecting me. But then when I went back home to Boston, subconsciously, sometimes things happen and you have a way of, taking that information and putting it in a little box and storing it away in the back of your mind, kind of like you have like boxes of shoes and sneakers in your closet, and you tend to put the shoes and the sneakers that you no longer wear, but you don't want to get rid of them, like in the back of the closet, and those boxes just stay back there. Well, some people have a way of doing that with experiences that have caused them harm. They kind of tuck that stuff away. And what happened was when I went back to Boston, that stuff started, like, you know, not that it came to the front of my mind, but I was reacting. I was reacting to the traumatizing experiences that I had in my childhood when I grew up in Boston. Now I'm back in Boston, and even though for some reason I wasn't aware of all that stuff, it started affecting me. So needless to say, the years went on, and that's just, the beginning of it. Like, through my life, I've had to learn how to manage my life with a mental health illness. And like I said, it didn't matter how much I educated myself. It didn't matter um the fact that I was educated enough to get good jobs. I always struggled with, like, keeping a job. Like I said, I'd get a good job, it'd go well for a year or 2, for whatever reason, I would get fired. I'd get another job, it would go well for a while, maybe 1 to 2 years, I'd get fired. And this continued on to be my life. Um, Losing jobs, like, working so hard to educate yourself and being able to have the education and the skills needed to get good jobs. You work so hard to be able to get good jobs, and like every time you would lose the job, and you try to figure out like what went wrong, what happened, how did this happen, you start to feel, it messes with your self-esteem. It messes with, your mentality. Like you're trying to figure out what it is that keeps going wrong, that you keep losing jobs. I don't know. It's a lot of work. And, again, like sometimes we can heal from things 10, 15, 20 years ago, but sometimes we encounter new things that can be traumatizing, things that affect our mental health, things that we have to continuously heal from. For me, it was the fact that it didn't matter how much I educated myself, it didn't matter about my skills, it didn't matter that I could get a good job. Something was wrong that I continued to keep losing jobs. And like I said, I would fall into depression. I just couldn't wrap my head around, what I was doing wrong. And on top of dealing with all the everyday normal stresses of life, I also have to manage a mental health illness. And then once you get on medication, now you have to manage the side effects that come with being on that medication. Needless to say, life is not easy. It's very difficult for most people, but when you have a mental health disease, the way that it affects your life, it's devastating. Like I said, mom never worked. My sister never worked. My sister has been on Social Security disability her entire life, and she had every right to be because, again, she struggled with her education. She never finished high school. She probably didn't go further than probably the 8th or ninth grade just because there was so much going on in our lives as children as far as my mother battling the disease of addiction, maybe having some underlying mental health issues that went undetected. There was a lot of violence in our home. The children were physically abused, mentally abused. I can't say for my brothers, but I know that the girls were sexually abused. Again, I've had to fight men twice my age, twice my size, and twice my stamina because these young adult men felt obligated to my body. So again, I can't say for my brothers as far as the sexual abuse, but definitely the girls. I know for myself. Um, and like I said, as far as my sister's first pregnancy, I think she was like 12 or 13 years old, and she had a miscarriage in front of me. Now, my sister and I are a year apart. So if she was like 11 or 12, maybe 13, the latest when she had her miscarriage, which means I was like freaking 11 or 12 watching this lady have a miscarriage in front of me and having no idea what was taking place. It was very scary. It was very traumatic. I was scared for myself. I was scared for my sister. Um, and even when it was happening, I had no clue because I don't know if I had been sexually touched at that time. If I had, maybe I blocked it out. Like I just had no knowledge of, the things that go on between a male and a female in the physical aspect. So I knew nothing about pregnancies. I knew nothing about miscarriages. I just remember my sister bleeding heavily from between her legs at the age of 11 or 12. Um, and it was quite scary. And I at the time didn't understand what was taking place. And this is just an example of why I say that I know for sure that I was being physically touched as a little girl. Whether or not my sister was physically touched, I mean, how else do you explain this girl, 11, 12 years old, having a miscarriage? Um, and it didn't stop there. My sister had her first baby at the age of 14 years old. And again, she was 14, I was 13. I could have been in denial at that point that I had been touched, or maybe I just didn't want to acknowledge it at that time. So when my sister got pregnant at 14 years old, even though I knew she was pregnant, I watched her belly grow, she had a baby. And I had no knowledge or clue as to, even though I am there, even though I am present, even though I am seeing this stuff with my own eyes, when you're young, you tend to see things that you don't have the words for. You don't have the knowledge, you don't have the wisdom. Like you see stuff and you just go into autopilot. This is the world around you. These are the things that happen. And for some reason, we stop believing that this stuff is normal. Like, I didn't know that this stuff was not normal. I didn't know that mom was hurting me. I didn't know that our lives were in danger. For me, that was just life. And it took the Department of Social Services coming in and removing me from my mother's house. And even though I was confused about it and I was angry about it, this is what I'm talking about, the gifts. Like, thank God somebody came and took me because I may not be here today to tell my story. I also talk about in my book, God's Gift to You, book one, about the children who didn't make it out of those neighborhoods. A lot of children died at the hands of these adults. So when you talk about someone being traumatized, I grew up in fear. I feared for my life being around my mother in the company that she kept every day. Um, there was a lot of fear. I was always anxious. When I encountered things that I ended up having to fight men twice my age, twice my size, twice my strength and stamina, resulted in me having a panic attacks. Like, even though now I know that it happened years ago, like, every day, for whatever reason, I could just have an anxiety attack or a panic attack. There are these things called triggers where something happens and I could get triggered. I could, you know, you guys, sometimes there's not even words. There's not even words to explain the things that go on in this world. You know, it's just a crazy world that we live in. So now, on top of trying to manage my mental health illness, signs and symptoms, causes and effects, on top of managing the medication that I have to take to treat my mental health illness and the side effects that come along with that, you're still trying to manage your life, like everyday life, educating yourself, gaining income, gaining employment, paying rent, paying bills. Um, it's just so much. It really is. And on top of that, being a young woman in the world, you know, um, there was a time that I was not only having harmful thoughts, but I was doing harmful things to myself. There was a time in my life where I felt like I wanted to die. And I spent a lot of time doing things to myself in the hopes that I would die. But God didn't allow that to happen. And again, when I talk about the gifts, because I don't ever believe that I really wanted to die, I think I just wanted the pain to stop. I just wanted it all to just stop. Another symptom that I have regarding my mental health disease is racing thoughts. And what that is like there's so much information in here, right? You have like all your good information, you have all your bad information. And the bad information could be like all the bad experiences throughout your life that has caused you harm. The bad thoughts in your head could be like all the voices of people that tell you what you should do, what you shouldn't do. Every time you get fired from a job, you start thinking like you're not good enough. Um, you're not smart enough. It's just so much noise, and sometimes the bad thoughts are louder than the good thoughts. And over the years, I've had to train my brain to tune out all the negative stuff and focus more on the positive stuff. And that's another gift that was given to me because, like I said, it took years for me to train my brain not to plug into the negative stuff. And eventually, over time, I stopped doing harmful things to myself. I realized that I didn't really want to die, I just wanted the pain to stop. And although life doesn't get better, the longer you live, the better you get at dealing with all the negative stuff. And on top of everything else, right, as if things wasn't hard enough, at the age of 35, my sister, she lost her life. There's a lot of questions around what happened, why. She was battling the disease of addiction. She, like I said, before she passed away, was diagnosed with bipolar. And ever since she was a little girl, I have watched her go in and out of mental health institutions. So it's not like the doctors and the providers did not know that not only did she have a mental health disease, but they knew she was battling the disease of addiction. So it got tricky because you have this young woman who is not only battling a mental health disease, but she's also battling the disease of addiction. And as we all know, mental health medication and street drugs do not mix. You will die. So even though the doctors knew that she was using street drugs, they still prescribed her the medication to treat her mental health disease. And she died. And most people will say, oh, she died because she was using drugs, not even knowing that she was on mental health meds. And the fact that there's so many questions about how she died, family members said that there was a note left, that there was a note left, as if she knew she was going to take her life and she left a letter behind. And when she died or took her life or whatever the case may be at 35 years old, she left 4 babies behind. She left 4 children in this world. So needless to say, after my sister passed on and after realizing that the state took her remaining children away, you know, it was a lot of stuff surviving my sister's death. So apparently at one point she voluntarily gave her 3 babies to the Department of Social Services, and it was just supposed to have been temporary until she got her life together. And the way I found out that she had done this, I think, was through other family members, and I had to call my sister and have a conversation with her, like, "Why would you do that without even discussing it with me first?" Like, you know, maybe we could have found a different way, a better way, because we come from a long line of people or women who have children and lose their children through the custody of the state because of either a mental health illness or, the disease of addiction. And like I said, my mom was taken from her mom when she was 7 years old, never to see or hear from her mother again, meaning that none of her children even met her mother. Mom was an only child, so we had no aunts and uncles from her. Um, my mother's children were taken from her. My sister, when she got pregnant at 14 years old, that child was taken from her. So when she made the decision to give up her remaining 3 children, because for whatever reason at the time she was struggling, she didn't even call me. She didn't even talk to me about it, like, and I had to say to her, like, "Why would you make that decision without talking to me first?" And then when she passed on, I just assumed that her children would automatically come to her family, and that didn't happen. And when I reached out to the Department of Social Services and tried to figure out how is it that these children were not returned to the family, they said that it was too late, that the adoption papers were already in process. Like, it was just crazy. It was just crazy. So not only did I lose my sister, but I lost her children. So eventually, I started doing harmful things to myself. It was so much stress, it was so much pain. Not only did I have to watch my parents bury their first child, but I had to go through the reality that I lost my sister. I had to watch my 2 brothers mourn the loss of their sister. I had to watch my now 11-year-old daughter mourn the loss of her auntie, and my daughter was very close to my sister. And then I had to watch my sister's children and what they had to go through losing their mother, and it was all too much. It was all too much. So, yeah, I started doing harmful things to myself. I don't think that I was thinking rationally. I don't think that I don't know what happened. I just couldn't imagine my life without my sister. For a long time, I wouldn't even talk about it because I couldn't even fathom my mouth saying these things. And I think maybe that's why I became harmful to myself because I stuffed all the feelings. And even after 2 years of harming myself, and when I stopped harming myself, I still couldn't bring myself to talk about it. I still couldn't fathom it. Anyway, I got through that, and I gotta tell you, right, when my sister passed away, my 18-year relationship ended. It ended because he told me that he had never seen me in the state that I was in at that time, and I had to tell him I never lost my sister before. And I don't think that he knew how to support me through that. I don't think he knew how to bring me back. I think that Something snapped in me when my sister left this earth. I was not the same person. Anyway, the guy I was with for 18 years while all this is going on, he's battling his own demons. So anyway, while all this is going on, the 18-year relationship that I was in, like I said, he was 19 when I met him. I was 20. We lived in Boston. In Boston, there are gangs. When men become of age, the gang members come in and want these young men to join their gangs. And in order for him to continue to live in Boston, like you can't be weak. You have to know how to fend for yourself. So, because these gangs wanted him to join or choose a gang and he refused, for the next 18 years of our lives together, I have watched this man get shot, get stabbed, be on the run from the police, in and out of jail. Um, the first time he got caught with his first gun, automatic 1 year. Second time, 5 years. And he was lucky on the 5 years. So while all this is going on, I am also in a relationship with a young man that although he was good to me, he wasn't physically abusive to me. He was good to me. He worked, I worked, he always had a good job, but he still had to deal with the things that come along with living in the Roxbury and Dorchester sections of Boston. So here I am, young woman with a child, single parent because things didn't work out between me and baby daddy. But I managed to meet someone. He had no children, and he took to me and my daughter, and me and my daughter took to him, and he raised my daughter like she was his own. And to this day, he doesn't have any children of his own. And to this day, even though him and I haven't been together in many years, them two still have a relationship. Even though she now knows her biological father and has a relationship with her biological father, to her, the guy that I was with for 18 years is daddy. Anyhow, um, after years of, trying to educate myself, gain good jobs that paid well, raise my daughter, address my mental health disease, I also had to watch this young man struggle in his life as far as growing up in Boston, getting in fights with gangs, getting shot, getting stabbed, on the run, you name it, he did it. And I was right there beside him the whole time. And it was crazy. So, around the time my sister passed on, this young man ended up getting shot in both his legs. So, I met him when I was 20. I stayed with him up until my mid-40s. Actually, it had to have been, oh my gosh. So my sister died at 35, right? My sister died at 35, which means I would have been 34 and I was still with him. And About a year after that, I spiraled out of control. His life spiraled out of control, and we never made it back from that. So, it was hard for me because for me, we are now both in our mid-30s, and he is still going through the same stuff he was going through when I met him at 19 years old, as far as gangs and violence and, it was crazy, and at the time, my sister passed away, and I am trying to manage how it affected me. I am now trying to manage the fact that the man that I was with all these years ends up getting shot in both his legs. So now I am running to the hospital to support this young man and what he was going through. And I got to tell you, when he got shot in both his legs, something changed in him. When I would look in his eyes, he was not the same person. There was something really scary about him after he got shot in both his legs. So here we are. I am still trying to deal with the fact that my sister is no longer here. He now has to deal with the fact that somebody shot him in both his legs, and it caused him to become a different person. We were both different people. I mean, like I said, he told me he never seen me in the state that I was in, and I had to tell him I never had to bury my sister before. So, of course, I'm in a state that you have never seen before because this has never happened before. Anyway, we didn't make it back from that. We ended up breaking up after 18 years. I continued on my journey, started doing harmful things to myself because not only did I lose my sister, but I also lost my 18-year relationship. It was just so much going on. It was just so overwhelming. And not even the fact that I lost my sister, but I also now had to realize that I may have lost her children, meaning that I would never get a chance to know them, to watch them grow up. They would never get a chance to know me or be a part of my life. And even like my daughter, when my sister passed away, she had a daughter at the time. Her daughter was probably 7. My daughter was 11. So my daughter had a relationship with my sister's first daughter. And now everything has changed. Like, my sister's gone, her children are gone, like, it was too much, it was too much, and then my daughter having to deal with the fact on top of all that, that the man she has always known as dad is no longer in the picture as well, because him and I split up during that time, and it was hard on me. It was even more horrific for my daughter because my daughter had to experience seeing her mother become harmful to herself. I don't know. I don't know. It's just really bad. Anyway, years go on. I ended up, after 2 years of harming myself, trying to recover and come back from that. I started going to this program um, that was going to help me get better. And during that time in that program, I met a young man. We became friends. We started dating. Um, this young man, had some stuff going on with him, and he was doing harmful things to himself, and I realized that I could not stay with that young man. Um, and that was fine. I ended that relationship. Um, I continued on my life, and then I met someone else, and we started dating, and he had his own place, I had my own place. We dated for a while, everything was great. We started talking about giving up our apartments and getting an apartment together, and we were gonna move in together and continue on our journey. Fine. We find an apartment. He gives up his place, I give up my place. We move into our new apartment together in January. By March, he gets a cold. I'm working. I had a damn good job. We had a beautiful apartment. It was gorgeous. Everything was brand new. Like he even did my floors. He did the walls. Like he did the work himself on the apartment, and we brought all new furniture, everything brand spanking new. It was beautiful. Life was great. I went to work every day. In March, he came down with a cold, and this cold continued for some time. And every day I would come home from work and he'd be like, "Babe, I'm getting better. Babe, I'm getting better." And I kept saying, "No, you're not. No, you're not." So finally I said to him, "When I come home from work today, you and I are going to go see a doctor." Matter of fact, the night before that, we were laying in bed and we were having a conversation, and I happened to ask him, how did his father pass away? And he told me his father passed away from cancer. We continued talking, and I learned that his father was a twin. And not only did his father die of cancer, but his father's twin brother died of cancer. So now I have this young man who has a cold that is not going away. So I told him, because he wouldn't go to the doctors on his own, even though I kept suggesting to him that he go see a doctor, he would not go. He kept saying he was getting better. I kept saying, "No, you're not." So finally, I told him, when I come home from work the next day, we were going to go and see a doctor. This was in March. We go to see the doctor. They do a chest x ray. First, they said he had sarcoidosis, which is like scarring on your lungs. Because of the lesions on his lungs, which showed up on the chest x-ray, they recommended that he goes to get an MRI. So we go, he gets the MRI. I was at work that day. He calls me. He says, "Babe," he says, "the doctor called with my MRI results, and they want me to come in, and they said that they would wait for me because I told them I had to wait for you to get out of work." But when he told me that the doctor said that they would wait for him, I already knew. Like I said, I have studied anatomy, physiology, biology. My whole life work was based on anatomy, working in doctor's office. This is what I do. So when he told me the doctor said that they will wait, I decided that I was going to tell my boss that I needed to leave early. And I told him, "Go to the doctor's office now. I am on my way." We meet up at the doctor's office, and The doctor comes in and tells him he has stage 4 lung cancer and there is nothing that they can do. So I had to sit in that room in that doctor's office with this young man who just got a death sentence. This was in March. For the next few months of my life, I spent caring for this man. I worked the whole time, but I'd get up in the morning, I'd go to work, I'd come home for lunch, I'd run back to work. I go to all his doctor's appointments with him. I watched this young, healthy, strong individual start to wither away in front of my eyes. I am now dealing with his family members, um, watching him go back and forth in and out of the hospital, getting admitted, getting released, going back to the hospital, getting admitted, getting released. I had to watch him manage his feelings and emotions behind his diagnosis. Um, his family at the time lived in Chicago. They started coming out to Springfield to visit with him. Him and I had to he wanted me to be his I don't know, like, when we were at the hospital, when he got admitted, the doctors had him sign some papers stating that I would be the one to care for him. There's a name for it, but I can't think of it right now, guys, because again, those racing thoughts. I went to school for this. I've done medical terminology. I know all this crap, but again, my head is just going so fast. Anyway, yeah, so the doctor said to him that he needed to have a person that when it came down to it and he could no longer speak for himself, they needed him to assign a person who would be able to speak for him. And he decided he wanted that person to be me. So I was in charge of making all of his decisions in the end. Um, we talked about if anything happened, if he wanted to be resuscitated, he said no. Um, it was a lot. It was a lot for me. The last time he got sick and he went to the hospital and they admitted him, they had informed us that if this was to happen again, for us to not bring him back to the hospital because there was nothing else they could do for him. And they sent us home with paperwork, um, and there was a booklet for me, and it was how to care for someone when they pass on. It was advising me on, darkening the room because they didn't want the light hitting his eyes when he passed on. Just informing me of what happens to the body when the spirit leaves the body. And I thought, my God, I am barely 40 years old. I can't do this. To have this man in our home and possibly pass on in our bed, it was a lot. And then there was like all the meds, because they couldn't do anything else for him. There was like experimental drugs. So there was like so many pills and so much meds that I had to create a chart and I would put like the days of the week up top, the times of day that he's supposed to get the med on the side, and then the rows, which would be this med on this day at this time. So I had a chart because when I would go to work, this man would be at home all day by himself and not take any of his meds. And by the time I came home from work, he was in so much pain that he would just stop popping the tops of the pill bottles, and the pills were like going anywhere. And he's like, "Babe, give me something, give me something." So I had to create a chart to make it easier for him to know on this day at this time you take this med, on this day at this time you take this med. Um, in the mornings, I would prepare food for him because he also would not eat from the time I would leave to go to work and come home. He was not eating, so I felt like if I would make the food, prep the food, and have it available for him when I would go to work, at least I would know that there's food for there at the house already made for him to eat. Um, this went on for a few months. He got his diagnosis in March. He died that September. And I was the only one in the room with him at the time he took his last breath. After that, because this young man had no life insurance, I had to do a fundraiser to help raise the money to give this young man a proper burial. His family came down from Chicago, and they stepped up to the plate as far as the finances. We had, community step up and offer services at whatever, he had everything planned out. He told me what to do, what not to do, don't let his family do this, don't let his family do that. Like, he told me everything he wanted, and me trying to give him his last wishes, I also had to deal with the fact that some of his family members wanted to do things this way, wanted to do things that way. And I had to let the family know, like, that is not what he wanted. Like, he made it very clear to me before he got too sick how he wanted things to go, and I was going to honor that. So there were times that I bumped head with family members because they wanted to do it their way. And he made it clear to me, don't let this one do this, don't let that one do that, because he knew his family better than I did. He knew how they were going to react. And he let me know ahead of time, he didn't want certain things to go a certain way. Anyhow, I I the community and his family planned and had his services. After I buried him, after his family went back to Chicago, I found myself alone in our apartment, and I could not do it. I could not sleep in that house. I'd go to work and I'd come home to our now cold and empty apartment, and I would try to sit there for 5 minutes, and my anxiety in that house, I couldn't even stay 10 minutes in that house. I ended up staying with a girlfriend of mine. She was married. Her and her husband allowed me to stay with them for some time. I was still working. Even my job thought it was weird that I didn't take time out of work. And I never experienced losing anyone before. I never had to bury anyone before. Yeah, yeah, with my sister, because my sister didn't have insurance. My parents didn't have the money to bury her. So me and my brothers had to, between the three of us, come up with the finances to give her a proper burial, because my father wanted to cremate her because it was the cheapest route to go. And one of my brothers said no. He didn't want his sister cremated. He wanted her buried. I agreed with him, and between me and my 2 brothers, we came up with what money we could to give my sister a proper burial. So for me to say that I never had to bury someone is a lie. It's just that that was my sister. This is a young man that I am, 1, not married to. 2, we just moved into our apartment together in January. He got sick that March and died that September. So it was a lot for me to have to get through. Um, Anywho, after staying with my girlfriend and her husband for some time, it got to a time where my girlfriend thought that I should go home after work and try to stay in the apartment. So there was a period of time I would get out of work, I would go home, I would not take my hat off, I would not take my coat off, and I would sit at the edge of my couch for a good 5 or 10 minutes till my anxiety kicked in and I kicked dust. Anyhow, eventually my girlfriend started telling me, like, eventually you need to learn to be in your home. You have to go back. You have to face it. And she was right, and I did. And when I got home, I stayed for a couple of days and realized I could not do it. I think I was in the middle of a nervous breakdown. So I made the decision to quit my job, give up my home, leave Springfield, and relocate to Rhode Island. And the only reason why I wanted to come to Rhode Island was because my mom and my 2 brothers were here. And I felt like mentally I was having a nervous breakdown and I needed to be close to family. You know, I had a lot of anxiety. I was running to the doctors every other day, telling them, like crying, like having anxiety attacks. Um, I kept telling the doctors I think I was gonna die. Like my mind snapped. I went through some stuff that it was crazy. So yeah, I quit my job, gave up my home, packed all my stuff, moved to Rhode Island, and moved in with my brother underneath me and his family. So my brother underneath me was already in Rhode Island. He had a girl. They have 2 sets of twins together. They had their family. They were living here and I needed help. I could not continue to stay in that apartment. I could not continue to live out in Springfield by myself. Mind you, I was living in Springfield away from home when they called me to tell me that my sister was gone. And a couple years later, now I'm in a new relationship, and now this person dies of cancer. So that's 2 deaths. I couldn't do it. I could not do it on my own. I don't think I was present. I don't when my sister passed away, I became harmful to myself, and for 2 years, I spent harming myself, and I recovered from that. I got better, life went on. I met this young man, and now this young man dies on me. But during that time, I did not become harmful to myself, as in I was physically doing things to injure myself. Maybe I was being harmful to myself in another way, meaning that I quit my job, gave up my apartment, and kicked dust out of Springfield, Mass, ran to Rhode Island because I felt like I needed to be closer to my family members. But let me tell you, relocating to Rhode Island was not easy for me. It was rough. I came here. I thought I could just get a job right away. That didn't happen. I had a 401k out of Springfield that I worked and invested into a 401k. And when I moved to Rhode Island, I couldn't get a job. I still had my car. I had to pay car insurance. Even though I moved in to my brother's house, I was paying my brother $400 a month to live with him because this is what we agreed on. And I felt like it was fair. I don't like to go move in on people into their home and not offer them any type of financial, what is the word I want to use? I got to slow my brain down. financial compensation, for allowing me to move into his home. So when I came here to Rhode Island, again, I could not get a job right away. I had to pay $400 a month for where I was living. All my stuff was in storage. I had to pay my storage fees. My car, I had to continue to pay my car insurance. So here I am with no job, no income, and my bills, and could not get a job. So the only option I felt in the end was to empty out my 401k. I'm telling you, this is my life. It never stops. You know, you would think that I would get used to it. You don't. And let me tell you, I'm going to stop here because we are an hour and a half into our session, and I'm going to continue on sharing with you guys my journey of my experiences since I moved here to Rhode Island. Like I said, it did not get better. Life just kept getting worse, and it does not stop. And I'm sharing all this stuff with you guys to give you an idea of what I go through in my life on a regular basis. I have a mental health disease because, first of all, like I said, in my adolescent years, I sustained blunt force trauma to my head, fighting grown men twice my age, twice my size, twice my strength and stamina. Um, being a survivor of childhood trauma. Um, the fact that mental health diseases apparently runs in our family. Um, it's just a lot, and like I said, I'm sharing this stuff with you guys because as I advocate for mental health awareness, mental health wellness tied to education, um, I'm giving you guys causes and effects of a mental health illness, what can cause a mental health illness, how does it affect you? Um, signs and symptoms. Where does my anxiety and panic attacks stem from? You know, how does having a mental health illness and being on meds affect your day-to-day life? Um, life has never been easy for me. It has never been easy for me. And it doesn't get any easier, but, you know, the only thing I can say is I guess any day above ground is a good day, right? I mean, I'm still here. I'm still alive. Um, I've gotten a lot of gifts along the way. Like I said, I have an adult daughter, and I believe many times, even in the times when I was being harmful to myself, the only reason I snapped out of being harmful to myself is that after 2 years of doing harmful things to myself, when I found myself on the kitchen floor about to die because I spent 2 years of my life doing things to myself in the hopes that I could die. But then when I finally got there and I was laying on my kitchen floor, I realized, like, oh my God, like, you're about to do to your family the same thing that your sister did. Like, you're about to do to your child the same thing that your sister did to her children. And who are you to have to make your parents have to bury another child? And I think for me, the biggest thing is I realized that my daughter could walk into the house at any moment now and find her mother dead. And I knew then that I had to get up, that I had to fight. And I think sometimes, like, people, we just get tired of fighting. We just don't wanna do it anymore. But life has taught me that every day you have to find a new reason to fight. You know, life has taught me that even though we might feel like we wanna die, we really don't wanna die. We just want the pain to stop. So this is why I show up here on my YouTube page advocating for mental health awareness, mental health wellness tied to education, sharing my journey with the world so that people may be able to identify with some stuff, um, acknowledge some things that if there is something going on in your life that is causing you great pain and you're doing harmful things to yourself in the hopes that you can stop the pain, you really don't want to die. You know, you have to think about all the lives that are tied to you that, people do love and care about you. And how is you leaving this earth going to affect those people? Anyway, guys, I'm well past my hour and a half. I hope that you will stay tuned, that you will join me in tomorrow's session. And I want to apologize, guys. I was not here yesterday, but I really struggle with my mental health the past few days. It has not been easy for me. And today I was just well enough to go ahead and do a session. Um, and hopefully that'll be the case tomorrow. Anyway, guys, have a good evening. Stay well. Be well.